Okay, so this is your second PowerPoint for the Industrial Revolution. And in this one, we go over just, rather simply and quickly the economic theories that were either emerging at the time, were fairly new at the time in one way, and the ones that are pretty influential. We've mentioned Adam Smith before. Adam Smith was the guy who wrote Wealth of Nations. If you look up that book, you can see it has a much longer title, but we've shortened it to that. Came out in 1776, American Revolutionary time. He was a Scottish economist, and he talks about the national wealth being maximized not through the government, but through individual pursuit of self interest. Now, in other words, basically capitalism, right? Hands off the economy, let the people do as they please. Things we talked about back, I guess, the Enlightenment time, we talked about Adam Smith. So capitalism is really born as of, as a product of the Industrial Revolution, where you're going to have people investing their money and then making a profit. So laissez-faire basically too means, in this case, the government should not give bailouts. Government should not try to control things like wages and prices and all of that. Okay, that the individual's pursuit of self-interest is what matters. Okay, so workers now, the proletariat, the people that are working for wages, and we talked about that too. We had an interesting conversation in one of the classes of 105. I don't remember what time it was. I remember who was talking about it though. But anyway, the fact that workers sell their labor for wages and they don't make any profit from what they're creating. This is going to be part of what we're going to hear from Karl Marx as to how wrong capitalism is in his opinion. So keep in mind good old Adam Smith here, The Wealth of Nations and laissez-faire. From there, we've got to talk about industrial capitalism. So Europe, the continent, and Great Britain, they don't develop into this true laissez-faire, hands-off, government stay out of the business of people making profits, laissez-faire economy. They don't do that. But they do end up having industrial capitalism as a part of, foundation of their economy throughout the European countries. Now, there's more socialism in some countries today than there used to be. The United States, I mean, we have some elements of socialism that people, when we talk about it in History 109, in American history, people don't realize that some of the things that we talk about as socialism are, well, things that a lot of people just, they don't understand. They're like, okay, well, how is it possible that my social security is actually something that was come up with, due to socialism partially? Well, I mean, I'm paying into it, right? Well, there's a whole thing about the whole idea of personal responsibility and why should the government take care of you? If we had true laissez-faire government, we wouldn't be doing things like pensions and social security, workman's comp, unemployment insurance, all these things that are wildly important right now as we're sitting through, this pandemic. All right. Now, the definition here of industrial capitalism is basically really easy. Textbook definition. Industry is the main activity by which the means of production, that's factories, raw materials, right, and capital and all that, are owned by private individuals. In other words, it's not some corporation somewhere that is run by the government. It is private entrepreneurs that have started this. Now, it may be a group of them and they may form a corporation, but it's not going through the government. It's going through individuals. Okay. So the means of production, the way that we create things, are owned by private people. So what's the profit? Well, the profit is where you create something in your factories, or you might not create it, but your workers will create it. And then you sell those goods for more money than you paid to create them. So your goal is going to be profit when it comes to capitalism. Whenever you have something, really, I could just say full stop right there. Whenever you have something, you're going to have critics, okay? Whenever there's new ideas or old ideas or theories or thoughts or just whatever, when people talk, you're going to get criticized sometimes, right? So we do have critics of industrial capitalism with the profit motive. And we're going to say, if we're a critic of industrial capitalism in this period of time, we're going to say that capitalism is really exploiting the workers. Okay. If you're paying them for their time and not giving them part of the profit, then you're using them. They're also going to comment on things like depersonalization, which is the fact that, say, the owners of the factories are going to become so far removed from the workers. They're not going to be, like we talked about in the other slide, they're not going to be acquainted with what their workers do on a daily basis. So they're not really going to necessarily see them as people, but they're going to see them as profit makers, right? See them as something that will work for themselves. Okay. So the first group of critics are the socialists. Now, the idea of socialism, we know if we're talking European socialism, we're talking, Western socialism, the ideas go back at least to Rousseau. Okay, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, remember we talked about him as a great philosopher, and the extreme Jacobins. And, go back and you'll see in your French Revolutionary Enlightenment and whatever, you'll see Rousseau in one and you'll see the Jacobins. But the idea is that society comes first over your and my individual needs and wants and goals. Now, the idea really, actually, I shouldn't have used the word needs, because when we use the word needs, we're talking about food and water, shelter and clothing, basic needs. Okay. And the socialists are not going to say that people should not have their basic needs met, but they are going to say that if you are striving for wealth, it's more important for us as a society to provide things like health care or something, universal basic income or something like that. Okay. So we'll talk about the socialists. We'll talk about a couple of different kinds of socialists, but the idea is always going to be that the society is more important than the individual. What I want doesn't matter as much as what's good for everyone. Okay. So now we're going to talk about the utopian socialists. These are the earliest socialist thinkers that we're going to talk about. But, as I said, it went back further really than this. There's all kinds of arguments as to when socialist thinking started. But the utopian socialist, remember we've talked about utopia. Thomas More coined the word. It means a good place but no place. We've talked also about the fact that we can never really have a utopia because we cannot agree, all of us, on what a utopia is. Therefore, it could never happen. Okay, a perfect world would not be perfect if people were disagreeing as what was perfect in their world, right? So we've got, first of all, the utopian socialist, which means that they're basically looking to create a perfect society, but as I just said, we know that's not something that is realistic. So the guy we mentioned first is Saint-Simon. Okay, that's his last name, Henri Saint-Simon. He's a French guy born into, the upper class, and he's known for writing a book called The New Christianity in 1825. Now, what he wants to do is reorganize society from the top. Okay, he wants to go full government. Okay, government should own the means of production and all of that. Government should control all of this. The government should set wages and all the things that we've mentioned. That's him. That's his idea. Okay. Now, the New Christianity, that book, that was basically where he was saying that we should act the way Jesus would want us to do, or act the way Jesus would want us to, rather, and treat people kindly and not use them by paying them wages and making all the profit for ourselves and all of those type of ideas. So part of what he said in the New Christianity was that Christianity, if you took it down to its very basic elements, in the same way that Descartes did that in terms of where he got to, I think, therefore I am, you have Saint Simon taking Christianity down to its very basics. Now, what he does is he says that he wanted to get rid of all the dogmas, and dogmas, that's a word that's used frequently in history when we talk about religion. And that's going to be a system of principles or doctrines of a religion, something like that. Okay, that's dogma. So he says, get rid of the dogma and all these things, and the Catholics and the Protestants and all of that. And he says basically, again, that everybody in society needs to work toward helping the poor. Society needs to reorganize in a way that we can help the poor. Okay, so that is his way of presenting what he believes to be the best idea as far as how to remake culture and society. Now, his ideology is called Saint Simonianism, and again, he's very much in favor of helping the workers. Right, the workers are the ones that are really being cheated at that point in time, and that is true, as you've seen from the Industrial Revolution that we talked about in the last slide. So Saint Simon, important guy, and we think that maybe his thoughts led to the specific movement of utopian socialism. So on slide 6, we have Charles Fourier. Fourier, I don't know, I can't pronounce French words. I've told you that all semester. But use your imagination the correct way it should be pronounced. But good old Charles here. He's different in that he wants to organize society from the bottom up, which means he wants the people to be in charge instead of the government. Okay, so he's going to be considered quite, I don't know, what's the word? He's considered to be way out there in his own time. Okay, he's living in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and he's going to have a lot of different views than most people at during his lifetime. He, for example, we think, created the word feminism, which in and of itself is a pretty big leap for a man in that particular time. Now, what he's looking at when he's coming up with his own philosophies and his own ideas of what he wants the world to be, he's going to support women's rights at a time when other people were absolutely not allowing women to speak out. So he believes that jobs, for example, should be open to women just like they are open to men. Okay. He said that, well, now this is where he really got out there. Okay. He said that traditional marriage is not a good thing. He said that it would hurt women just as badly as it would, hurt anyone else, maybe worse, being tied down, but also women then having to deal with being subordinate to a husband in some cases, and all of that. Okay. So he was way, way ahead of his time in saying things like free love, right? He understood that humans, that there's going to be same-sex attraction and excuse me, excuse me, my voice again. He argued that people can enjoy whatever they want sexually as long as no one's hurting each other. Okay, so this is part of his basic belief system. All right, so here's how it was going to work. Okay, he wanted things to be decentralized. Remember, in the hands of the people, not in the hands of the government. Okay, hands of the people, that's decentralization. And voluntary. He didn't want anybody, the government or anybody else, forcing people to do this. Now, his idea was that people would live in phalanxes. Okay, they are sort of like you would envision maybe an apartment complex or maybe even a hotel-like place, where where you have school and health services, and you have your grocery stores, you have everything you need there. And he figured that about 400 families should be able to live there, and all of them would work. Now, the interesting thing about him, besides all the other stuff, was that he was constantly just he had a lot of of ideas that really, in some ways, were, I don't know, not necessarily ahead of his time, but in some ways just absolutely out there, to the point where it's hard to even understand what he meant by some of them today. Okay, so if you read some Fourier rather, um, he's going to think that children, for example, are, as very, very young ages, he believes that children can do a lot of things. Okay, he thinks that children want change all the time, and therefore people want change all the time. And for it, he wants to see people living in a way that everyone was working together. Again, utopia, right? He wanted people to live in a way that everyone got along and everyone worked together and all sorts of things. And that he also believed that people should change jobs very often. And in his case, we're talking about every so many hours, maybe every 8 hours or something like that. It's not like you're going to be a lawyer one day and a doctor the next day or whatever. Nothing like that. We're talking about these Felixes have their own factories. And what he wanted eventually to happen is that the Felixes, that were self-sufficient, they could maybe eventually start trading with other Felixes. He believed, again, that marriage was a bad thing, especially for the women, but both women and men. And he said, therefore, that people should postpone marriage until they're at least, in their 30s. Okay. And this is I know, this is kind of it's funny, sad part, is that he had it well known that he would be in his office every day in the afternoon waiting for anyone who wanted to come and work with him on starting up a Felix. And it never happened. Okay. So his idea of utopia just wasn't to be. So continue with our utopian-minded men. We've got Robert Owen. Robert Owen was a factory owner, textile factory, clothing, um, the first factories that became big were, of course, textile factories. But at some point, I mean, this guy had become wealthy, super wealthy, but he is going to be known as one of the founders and one of the people who laid the foundation for utopian socialism. So what he had done is he had become wealthy, and again, I think he's from Scotland, I think. But anyway, he's going to gain a lot of wealth, and eventually he's going to move to the United States. Now, before he moves to the United States, we'll talk about a little bit what he had done with his factory. He had felt really sad for the workers, and he came to believe that he and his peers who were making profits were evil. Okay, so he started, first of all, excuse me, he started first of all talking about cutting the hours for the workers, because this is going to be in the early 1800s, and cutting the hours for the workers, they didn't want to do that. So he was calling for an 8-hour day. That's something that's not going to happen for a very long time, okay, more than 100 years later. But he was early. Okay, now he's going to be a guy that says he wants to create a place where people can live together in morality and ethics and you know, shared, I guess, ideas of the way they want to live their lives, right? So Robert Owen, he had provided, for example, education for the children that were working in his families, and he had done a lot of things to help a lot of his workers. But he becomes a guy who sort of, as they say, puts his money where his mouth is, because instead of just writing about these things, instead of just dealing with his own workers, he decides that he's going to go to the United States and set up what's called a commune. Okay. He started with a place in Indiana, right north of us, right? It's called New Harmony. Now, New Harmony, Indiana was the biggest, I guess, really, of the communal experiments, I guess is the best way to say that. And he's going to come over, Robert Owen and his son are going to come over to the United States in 1824. And they're going to start, building and working on New Harmony and bringing people in. And he really wants the Americans to embrace socialism, okay, this utopian view. And he's going to give an address or two, I don't remember how many, to the United States House of Representatives and Congress itself, and all sorts of things that he's doing trying to spread his ideas. So you're gonna have him communicating with people as important as Thomas Jefferson, right? And James Madison, some of the founders. And Owenism, as they came to call it, is going to be one of the first socialist ideas that actually took hold in the United States. And we can see that as, again, a foundation of some of our ideas in the United States that eventually come about as far as helping people. Now, what happens though is when Owen comes over, New Harmony and so on, he's going to come over and then he's going to go back home to Great Britain, and he's going to leave his son in charge. And basically, New Harmony, which, remember, the word harmony doesn't just mean music, okay? It means getting along. We have great harmony, we have peace, and all that. So when he leaves his son in charge, he's actually going to find that his son wasn't able to hold things together in the commune in New Harmony, and it's going to fall apart within a couple of years. Okay. So he's going to end up, he was a philanthropist. He's a guy that actually gave away a lot of money, helped a lot of people. And he really had a heart for the working class and for the workers themselves. He had a heart to, pass labor laws to prevent children from having to work. And again, in many ways, he truly was ahead of his time with those type of thoughts and action that he put out there. But when he dies, I mean, he dies a poor man. He dies um, with just a little bit of a trust that his sons had set up for him. Okay. So anyway, he's an interesting guy. To me, I like him because he wanted to help the workers, particularly the children, and he embraced the idea of making the conditions better for the workers. So now we're going to look at scientific socialism with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. And the thing about these two guys, they're going to work together and they come up with something that's called Marxist theory. Okay. Marxism or Marxist theory is where they're analyzing class relations and social conflict and so on. And you're going to see Karl Marx and Frederick Engels are the ones who are going to actually popularize this thought, this interpretation, by saying that you can look back at history and you're going to see that there's an upper class and a lower class. And at some point, society is going to transform based on that. So they believe that they can make predictions basically by looking at history, which is a little shaky at best. And as we'll see as we go later into the 1800s, um, Marxists are going to have to revise their original ideas because things really do change, and nothing is able to be accurately predicted historically. So Engels is going to help Karl Marx put together Marxist theory. And you're going to see that in 1848, he and Karl Marx are going to write the Communist Manifesto. Okay, came out 1848, and this is something that was published in a very important year in Europe, in the United States. 1848 is one of those years where so many things are happening. Okay, for example, in the United States, we have the women's suffrage movement meeting at Seneca Falls with Susan B. Anthony and all of that, and yeah, and all the others that came there. That's one thing I would pick if I had to pick the beginning of the women's rights movement in the United States. You could pick Seneca Falls really in 1848. You're also going to have the Communist Manifesto. You're also going to have over in Europe a bunch of revolutions that are going on in all kinds of places. You're going to have another smaller French Revolution in 1848. And you're going to see other revolutions as the revolutionary fervor spreads across Europe. And you're going to see later the change in alliances that those revolutions are going to make in some ways when we get to the point where we're talking about the beginnings of World War I and so on. Okay, so scientific socialism. Well, you've got Karl Marx. His name is the one that's on the idea here, and he's going to write eventually this enormous book called Das Kapital. Okay, it's also, I mean, that just translates to the capital or capital. And Karl Marx is going to, in that book in particular, he's going to explain how the capitalist mode of production is not going to work. Okay, and what's going to eventually happen when the proletariat, the working classes, rise up and overthrow the ruling classes, sometimes known as the bourgeoisie. Yes, exactly a word that we used during the French Revolution, right? The bourgeoisie. So anyway, Karl Marx is going to try to make predictions based on what he saw throughout history of upper and lower class and the struggles between those two classes. Okay. Now, scientific socialism, therefore, is understanding and trying to predict social, economic, and any kind of legal, any kind of actions in the future. Okay, by looking back to history. That's not something that Karl Marx called what he was doing. Okay, he's going to end up much later being given that title, as a scientific socialist. He didn't call it that. Okay, Karl Marx and Engels, they just call it, Marxism. So later on, Frederick Engels, among others, is going to use that term, scientific socialism, to describe Marxism. Okay. Now, you're going to see that there was a book that was written much earlier by a guy you don't need to worry about, but there's a guy named Proudhon who actually wrote a book called Property is Theft. Okay, property is theft. Get that in your mind for a minute. And he's going to actually be a supporter of a society that has a government based upon reason and science and what's best for everyone. Okay, so anyway, that's where the term came from. But then Engels is going to use that to describe what he and Marx had come up with. Okay, and I need to talk about a couple of things that were on the PowerPoint before this one, but I don't want to go back and record everything again because it's not necessary. But the ways that Marx and Engels changed socialist thought is definitely important. And what they're talking about here is there will be a violent revolution, like I mentioned before. Okay, proletariat, the working class, are going to rise up and overthrow the capitalist or the bourgeoisie, the ones who own the means of production. Okay, and then everyone eventually will become equal. Now, the second way is Karl Marx said that you could scientifically observe history, and that from his observations, socialism will eventually spread and socialism will end up triumphing. Okay. Now, in reality, okay, not so much. Socialist ideas, yes, but Marxist doctrines, no, not really in most places. So I have on this slide, number 9, I have Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto, and one of the quotes that is famous from Marx and Engels is, "Workers of the world, unite." Okay, so Marx is going to believe that you have more in common with a worker who's getting paid wages in another country than you do with a rich man in your own country. Now, keep that in mind, because as we get to the end of the 1800s, we're going to see some things that no one really predicted happening, including, nationalism. Okay. So Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto, you need to know both of those, just at least by name. On this side, you're just going to see the 5 Marxist doctrines, but we're not going to talk about each one of them while we're sitting here looking at this particular slide. You're going to see surplus value doctrine, economic determinism, dialectical materialism, class struggle, and socialist evolution. But each one of those is going to have their own PowerPoint as we move on. First, we see the surplus value doctrine. And we've talked about this in class. I've mentioned it on some of the narration and stuff. But basically, this is the idea that workers are creating the value of what they're making, right? You're working in a factory, you're creating these things. So basically, Karl Marx says paying them wages is not enough. All you're doing is paying them for their time. So the capitalist, the owner, the one who's making the profit, is a thief. Okay, why? Why? Well, because, again, the idea that he had was that if you're only getting paid for your time and the guy who is employing you is getting paid for your product plus a profit, then the capitalist is taking from you. You should have a share of that profit. Okay, that's called the surplus value doctrine, that the owner is not creating the value, the workers are. So economic determinism, what this is saying, basically is that the economy is what controls everything, the way that our world is. It all comes down to the economy, okay? And I don't know if I said it to you guys. I may have. I said it to one of the classes a few weeks ago when we were still in person. But sometimes it comes up and I'm talking about like how bad our memories are, for example. But I remember that there was this very famous political debate, presidential debate, and one of the candidates came up, with, "It's the economy, stupid." And I've always thought, for years, I had always thought it was George H.W. Bush, 41. And then I found out it was Bill Clinton. I was like, whoa, I didn't know it was Bill Clinton who said that. Well, it's true, though. Without the stupid part on the end of it, it would be nicer to just say, it's the economy. The economy is going to depend, or is going to rather determine how everything else is set up. I mean, are you going to have a high standard of living? Are you going to have enough food? Are you going to have enough land? What's the legal system going to look like? How much of a military are you going to have? Think of anything and note that it does make sense. The economy is the foundation for your society, and whatever we strive to achieve comes down to the economy in one way or another. I like dialectical materialism. I think that's really interesting. You have, this is not something that Karl Marx thought up himself, or anyone, that's dealing with this at the time. You have a great philosopher, a German philosopher named Hegel, okay? And Hegel is going to come up with one part of this idea of dialectics, or the dialectical method, okay? And this has to do with philosophy, and it relies on basically contradictory process between two opposite sides. Okay. And that's, it can get a little bit heady, but I've always loved this. I've always thought it was so interesting. And then you see Marxism using the dialectic as one of their parts, of their five major points. Dialectical materialism, though, specifically. Okay. So dialectics, again, you're going to have people, I don't know, Plato and others, Socrates and ancient Greeks, are going to be arguing, contrary positions and so on. But what we see here is when you have Hegel himself, the German philosopher, in the 1800s, he's going to have some other, I guess, ways that he explains the dialectic. Okay. Now, he does give credit to everyone before him that had already thought of similar ideas. But what he's saying, and I think probably the easiest way without getting into really deep philosophy to explain it, is you have two different economic orders, okay? As you have the one that is currently being used, okay? And then you have the younger people. And the younger people, a lot of times, or maybe there's a group within, different group within that wants to change it. But either way, what's going to happen is these two orders are going to clash. Okay. The old versus the new is the way I always think of it. Okay. And once you've seen the era's dominant economic order challenged by a different one, then what you see is not that different system taking over. What you see is kind of a hybrid. Okay, that's the way I think of it. Okay, it happens kind of more slowly than just a rival economic system coming in and saying, woohoo, we're in charge now. Because what happens is the rival system, as I always think of it as the new system, okay, the challenger, you're going to have the rival system using parts of the old system that they believed were important. Okay. So that's dialectical materialism, because Marx is saying everything comes down to the economy, and tied to the economy, we have materialism. Okay. What we've created and what we purchase and all of that. This one we've already talked about enough. I mean, really, the class struggle has always existed. In this case, the latest, according to Marx, proletariat versus capitalist. Remember, proletariat, that's the workers, capitalists, or bourgeoisie, the owners, the ones who are oppressing the workers, according to Marx. And that at one point in time, proletariat's going to rise up and overthrow the capitalist. And then our last slide on this video is the last of the five major points here of Marxism. It's socialist evolution. Okay, evolution means change, right? And generally change for the better. So what he believes, because of the class struggle and the economic determinism and everything, what he believes is that a violent revolution will happen. Okay, the proletariat will rise up. Okay, and that this would result in a higher form of socialism called communism.